At the Christmas gift exchange, my daughter-in-law gave me a mop and said, "You'll need this when you move." On Christmas night, I was hoping for a gesture of affection, a symbolic memento, maybe a perfume or a frame with family photos. But what I received was a mop, and a sentence I will never forget. "You'll need this when you move." In that instant, something inside me broke. I didn't know it then, but that gift wasn't a gift. It was the beginning of something much larger, more painful, and transformative. With time, the pain turned into clarity. Rejection became strength. And what seemed like the end was in fact the starting point of a new chapter in my life. A chapter of discovery, confrontation, and reclaiming my place in the world. Today, looking back, I see not just the wound but the woman who rose from it. I'm so happy to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment with the city you're watching from, so I can know how far this message of courage and overcoming has reached. The room was lit by twinkling lights and carefully hung ornaments, but the atmosphere clashed with the decorations. It was our traditional Christmas dinner, and as always, I had done everything with care. I set the table, chose the embroidered tablecloth, and used the china from my youth. Around me, familiar faces smiled, but there was something in the air that made my chest tighten. Christopher, my son, avoided my gaze, and Melissa, his wife, maintained that restrained, forced smile. From time to time, they exchanged quick glances, heavy with something I couldn't decipher. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, or my imagination. The children ran around excitedly in their Santa hats, and I clung to that energy like a lifeline in a stormy sea. But every time Melissa whispered something in Christopher's ear, and he just nodded, my heart beat faster. The food was delicious, but the taste seemed distant, almost mechanical. I wanted to fool myself to believe it was just another Christmas like so many others. The glasses clinked, toasts were made, but my soul didn't toast with them. I watched their gestures and expressions like someone reading a book in another language. I understood just enough to realize something was out of order. It was as if I were an extra on the set of my own home. Melissa raised her glass to me and smiled, but there was a tone of scorn that made me shudder. Christopher didn't correct her, nor did he seem to notice. When everyone stood up to exchange gifts, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't the cold. It was an intuition that, though subtle, was becoming increasingly present. I had lived long enough to recognize rehearsed silences and invisible cuts. And at that Christmas dinner, everything seemed to follow a script I hadn't been invited to write. Something was wrong, but I still didn't know what. The tree was flanked by colorful packages, and the shiny wrapping paper made it seem like there was only joy there. Everyone picked up their gift and laughed, commented, and thanked with enthusiasm. When it was my turn, Melissa came forward with a long, pliable package. "Here you go, Donna. I thought a lot before choosing," she said, with a tone somewhere between mockery and irony, impossible to ignore. I felt all eyes turned to me, as if they were waiting for my reaction. I opened the wrapping, trying to maintain what little dignity I had left. It was a mop. A simple, cheap, and suggestive mop. The silence that followed was louder than any Christmas music. "You'll need this when you move," she added, with an affected smile that pierced me like a cold blade. Christopher looked at the floor, visibly uncomfortable, but said nothing. My face was burning, and it wasn't from the heat of the fireplace. Shame washed over me so suddenly that I could barely force a smile. I thanked her in a faint voice and set the gift aside, like someone hiding an open wound. No one laughed. No one spoke. It was as if they all knew something I didn't yet, as if they had been waiting for that moment. Humiliation enveloped me like a dense, sticky fog. I went back to the kitchen with the excuse of getting more dessert, but I needed a moment alone to breathe. I looked at my reflection in the microwave door. A woman who seemed smaller than she was, invisible in her own home. In that instant, I realized the gift wasn't just in poor taste. It was a message, and worse, a public message, delivered in front of my entire family. The whole room fell silent, but my heart was screaming. Later, in my room, I did everything I could not to think. I folded the bedding, checked the windows, tried to read a passage from my favorite book. But nothing worked. The image of the mop was still seared into my mind, and her words echoed, repeating in cycles. "When you move." Move where? And why? I hadn't talked about moving at all. It gnawed at me. I lay down and stared at the ceiling for long minutes. My eyes stung, and the pain I tried to hide in front of everyone now came out in silence, as tears that don't ask for permission. I felt betrayed, disposable, as if all my effort, care, and love had been thrown away. I was the woman who had created that family, who had welcomed each one of them with generosity, and now it was as if I were being asked to leave. I could have swallowed it and moved on, as I had done so many times before. But something in me refused to accept that gift as merely a bad joke. For the first time in a long time I felt anger. A quiet but dense anger. That was a warning. And I needed to understand what was behind it. Even if it hurt, even if it broke me. The loneliness of that night was different. It wasn't just the absence of company. It was the absence of belonging. My house, my home, suddenly felt like it was no longer mine. And in that stifled cry, wrapped in the sheet as if in a cocoon, something began to change inside me. It was in that stifled cry that my journey began. The days following Christmas were filled with an uncomfortable silence. Christopher and Melissa stayed home longer than usual, claiming to be on vacation from work. However, there was something strange about the times they spoke on the phone. I heard whispers behind closed doors, abrupt pauses when I walked down the hall. One day, I left my room earlier than usual and caught them whispering in the kitchen, Melissa's voice sharp and irritated, with Christopher just nodding in agreement. I tried not to listen, to respect their space, but it was my house. My intuition was beating like a drum, demanding attention. I approached the door slowly without making a sound and could only hear fragments. If she doesn't agree, then we'll sell it anyway. My blood ran cold. I walked in naturally as if I just wanted water. They smiled nervously, and Melissa quickly changed the subject. The tension between them was palpable, and once again, the knowing glances reappeared. I thought about asking what they were hiding, but I swallowed the urge. The fear of hearing a truth I didn't want to know was stronger. This kind of pain was different. It was slow, insidious, and corrosive from the inside. Christopher seemed torn, but it was clear he didn't have the strength to oppose his wife. And I once again found myself occupying an invisible place. Later, I heard Melissa on the phone, speaking in a hurried tone, saying, "She's still here, but not for long." I walked into the living room, and at the exact moment I entered, she hung up the phone. She feigned surprise as if my presence had been unexpected, and quickly stood up to go upstairs. Melissa hung up the phone as soon as she saw me. The next afternoon, I took advantage of the sun to tend to the front garden, trying to find some peace in my routine. Maria, my neighbor, waved from her gate and soon walked over to me with her ever-watchful expression. "Are you all right, Donna?" she asked, looking around as if sensing something was out of place. I answered with a rehearsed smile, but she wasn't convinced. Then in a lower voice she commented, "Have you been getting strange visitors around here?" I thought for a moment. No one had come to see me directly, but I spent a lot of time inside the house. Maria then told me she had seen a black car parked out front twice that week, and that a man in a blazer was taking pictures of the gate. My heart skipped a beat. He looked like a realtor. "They've been offering money for old houses," she explained, like someone who had seen this story before. My breathing grew short. I stood there with my hands dirty with soil, looking at my house with new eyes. Could they be trying to sell it without my knowledge? That simple conversation brought all my fears to the surface. Maria gave me a look that said she understood more than she was saying. "Stay sharp, Donna. Don't be so trusting," she said before leaving. My hands were trembling slightly, and the wind seemed colder than usual. Suddenly everything started to fall into place. The whispers, the mop, the comment about moving. It wasn't paranoia. It was a warning. The life I thought was solid was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. I went back inside, carrying with me something that wasn't in my arms, the growing doubt that was turning into fear. She said, "I saw someone taking pictures of your garden." That night, I waited for Christopher to be alone in the living room, as he usually was after dinner. I sat next to him and with all the calm I could muster, asked if they were thinking of selling the house. He seemed to choke for a second, then laughed awkwardly. "Of course not, Mom. Where did you get that idea?" The coldness of his reply cut me more than any confirmation would have. That wasn't a denial, it was an evasion. I pressed on, asking if a realtor was involved. Christopher then stood up and said I was imagining things, that I had been stressed since Christmas. He used soft words, but his tone was that of someone who wants to end a conversation without really answering it. I was left there alone on the sofa, listening to his footsteps going up the stairs, taking with them all the truths he refused to share. In that instant, I realized something had broken between us. My son, the one I had held in my arms, was hiding something from me. And worse, there was a complicity between him and Melissa that completely excluded me. I was no longer part of the decisions nor of their trust. I had been reduced to the status of a temporary guest in the house I had built. The pain of that realization was deep, but necessary. It was as if scales had fallen from my eyes. I needed to face what was in front of me, no matter how cruel it was. And in the silence of that night, with a heavy heart, one question hammered relentlessly. I began to wonder, what is happening to my son? The anguish of the last few days turned my unease into action. When Christopher and Melissa left for the supermarket that morning, I felt it was time to stop pretending everything was fine. His makeshift office was in the guest room, with a desk and several stacks of papers. I entered with light steps, like someone trespassing on forbidden ground, even though it was my own house. My heart was racing, but I knew I had to look. I started with the loose papers on the desk: bills, work notes, various drafts. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until I noticed a blue folder, hidden under a pile of old magazines. I opened it carefully, flipping through printed sheets with legal terms I barely understood. There was something formal there, documents bearing Christopher's name as the signatory. But that wasn't what I was looking for or feared finding. I went to the locked drawer, which was curiously unlocked. When I pulled it open, I found older folders, company papers, personal things. I went through them one by one until at the bottom I felt something thicker and recently placed. It was a manila envelope, with real estate agency labels. My hands went cold as I touched it, as if the answer to the discomfort that had been eating at me for days was right there. At the bottom of a drawer, something made me tremble. I opened the envelope slowly, almost hoping it was a mistake. But it wasn't. It was a formal contract for the sale of the property, with a stipulated price, the buyer's name, a date, and what took my breath away, Christopher's signature. I read and reread it, searching for a logical explanation, a justification that would ease the pain growing in my chest. Nothing. The sale was in an advanced stage, and I hadn't even been informed. I felt my world spin. My own son, the one I had given life to, was planning to take from me what I had built with so much effort. The fine print of the contract revealed that everything was already in motion, needing only a final authorization, something that perhaps wasn't even under my control. I closed my eyes, trying to hold back the tears, but they came anyway. The floor seemed to have disappeared from under me. My own son was selling my house. With the papers still in my hands, I rushed out towards Maria's house. I needed someone I could trust, someone who could help me understand this. She received me in alarm, seeing my pale face and teary eyes. "Sit down, Donna. Tell me what happened," she said, pulling me inside with care. I fell apart in broken words and sobs, showing her the documents without being able to explain properly. Maria read every page with attentive eyes, frowning at each detail. When she finished, she closed the folder firmly and looked at me seriously. "This is serious, Donna. Very serious. They're trying to push you out bit by bit." My stomach turned, but her hug kept me on my feet. For the first time, I felt I wasn't completely alone. She started asking practical questions, talking about witnesses, rights, power of attorney. But I was still far from thinking legally. My grief wasn't just for the house, it was for the broken trust, for the family I thought I had. It was hard to accept that all of this was really happening. And yet, I knew I couldn't go back now. I returned home with the papers tucked inside my purse and a heart heavier than ever. The road ahead would be long, confusing, painful, but necessary. I had been pushed into a place I didn't choose, and now I had to learn how to fight back. I had to do something before it was too late. It took me 2 days to find the courage to call my daughter. I didn't want to worry her, much less make her think I couldn't handle the situation. But that afternoon, the weight was too much to bear alone. I picked up the phone with trembling hands and dialed her number, praying she would answer quickly. When I heard her voice, everything came crashing down. "Honey, I need to tell you something." I began trying to control my crying. I spoke in pauses, not revealing everything, but making it clear that something was very wrong. I told her about the mop, the whispers, the papers I found. Her silence on the other end of the line cut me more than any judgment. But when she spoke, her voice was firm. "They're doing what?" she said, incredulously. I tried to soften it, saying maybe I was misinterpreting things. But Karen knew me too well to believe that. I heard her deep sigh, that sound that precedes a decision. And then, with a calm that only the strong possess, she said what I so desperately needed to hear. "Mom, I'm coming over this week." The next day, Melissa seemed restless, as if she sensed something. During breakfast, she commented casually, "Did you know Karen has been very stressed at work? Maybe it's better for her to rest at home." I pretended not to understand the hint, but my expression gave me away. Later, I overheard the conversation between her and Christopher in the living room, where she was trying to convince him that his sister's visit would be unnecessary. Christopher was visibly torn. As wrong as his decisions had been, there was still a conflict within him that showed in his eyes. "It's going to cause trouble. She'll come full of ideas," Melissa said, trying to persuade him. But he just shook his head, like someone who no longer knew what was right or wrong. I heard everything from the hallway, my heart beating in an irregular rhythm. Melissa even suggested we tell Karen the house was under renovation, or that I had the flu, any excuse to keep her away. But it was too late. The seed had been planted, and nothing would stop my daughter from coming. I knew Melissa felt her authority was threatened, and that bothered her deeply. For the first time, she would lose control of the narrative. In the late afternoon, Christopher approached me and said that perhaps it wasn't the best time for visitors. I responded with a direct gaze without looking down. "Karen has the right to come see her mother." He didn't reply. He just turned around, looking more lost than ever. Christopher didn't know which way to turn. 2 days later, I heard a car horn and ran to the window. It was her. Karen arrived with a small suitcase, determined steps, and watchful eyes. We hugged at the door like two women who knew something important was about to happen. It wasn't long before I showed her the papers. She read them carefully, her face hardening with each line. When she finished, she went straight up to Christopher's room. I stayed in the living room in silence, listening to the echoes of their conversation. I couldn't understand all the words, but the intensity was clear. Karen wasn't shouting, but she spoke with a firmness only she possessed. Her brother tried to explain, to justify, stumbling over his own sentences. But Karen wasn't accepting excuses. She wanted answers. And above all, she wanted justice. Minutes later, she came down the stairs alone, holding the contract as if it were irrefutable proof. "Mom," he confirmed it. "The sale is all set. And she's behind everything." I felt a shiver run down my spine, and my daughter, with a determined look, handed the papers back to me. It was as if she were saying, "Now it's up to us." Karen sat next to me and held my hand firmly. "You're not going through this alone, Mom. But now we need to decide how to react." I took a deep breath, feeling that this was a turning point in my story. Either you solve this or I will. That morning, I went to the market just to clear my head. Karen insisted I get some rest, try to distract myself. The small town was still the same in many ways, but it had been years since I'd walked those aisles calmly. It was there, among the cleaning product aisles, that I saw a face that took me straight back to the past. Jose Smith. The name came to my mind even before he recognized me. He was carrying a basket with a few items and had the same serene eyes as when we were young. We looked at each other for seconds that felt too long to be casual. "Donna," he said, with that same gentle smile I remembered so well. My heart raced, not out of romance, but for everything that reunion represented. Memory, strength, and perhaps hope. "Jose, it's been so long," I replied, trying to contain my emotion. We talked right there as if time had just taken a pause. I told him the basics without going into detail, but he quickly realized something was wrong. "Are you okay?" he asked, concerned. I hesitated but ended up telling him about the contract, about what they were trying to do to me. He listened to everything attentively, his expression serious and focused. He smiled as if we had never been apart. We sat on a bench in front of the market, and Jose asked me more specific questions. When I mentioned the name of the real estate agency, he frowned. Donna, did you know I retired as a lawyer specializing in real estate law? I was surprised. The sweet boy from my youth had become someone who, now, could perhaps truly help me. I took the papers from my bag and handed them to him right there. Jose read every line calmly, his eyes scanning the clauses as if searching for invisible traps. This is serious. But there are loopholes, he said, looking back at me. If you didn't authorize anything, this contract can be voided. They can't sell without your consent. For the first time in days, I felt a thread of hope cut through my pain. Jose wasn't speaking on impulse. He knew what he was talking about. We need to act quickly before they can register this at the courthouse, he added. I nodded, still scared, but feeling that this helping hand that fate had placed in my path was everything I needed at that moment. Jose jotted down some information and said he would be back the next day. We said goodbye with a light, respectful hug, but one full of meaning. A new piece had entered my chessboard. They can't do this without your consent. In the afternoon, Jose came to my house, where Karen and Maria were already waiting for me. I showed the papers again and repeated what he had explained. Karen looked at him with suspicion at first, but soon recognized his competence and composure. Maria, for her part, seemed grateful that we finally had someone with legal knowledge on our side. In a few minutes, the three of them were discussing strategies and possible actions. That living room, once filled with silence and sadness, was now filled with firm voices and practical ideas. Jose suggested filing for an injunction to suspend any transaction until we clarified the facts. Karen promised to look for messages and proof of manipulation. Maria committed to being a witness if necessary. It was as if suddenly the pain had transformed into action. I just watched, feeling everything change. I never imagined that such different people could unite for my sake. But there they were, each contributing what they knew, what they could, gradually giving me back the feeling that I still had value. Jose looked at me and said simply, "You're not going through this alone." I got emotional, but this time the tears were of relief. I still didn't know what the path ahead would look like, or if we would have enough strength to beat them. But one thing was certain. I was no longer silent nor isolated. The woman who cried alone on Christmas night now had a network forming by her side. Little by little, I was no longer alone. That morning, Melissa seemed more helpful than usual. She offered to make my tea, insisted on walking me up to my room, and stayed nearby the whole time, watching my every move. Suspicious, I remained alert. But when I went to go down the stairs, I felt a subtle tug on the rug that was never there before. I slipped. The impact on the floor was hard, and for a few seconds everything spun around me. The pain in my hip was intense, but what hurt more was the satisfied look I saw on her face before she feigned concern. She ran to call for help, shouting with exaggeration, as if she were in a panic. The doctor came shortly after, and Melissa made a point of narrating the facts, with a suspicious wealth of detail. "She's been very confused lately, and now she fell on her own," she said, while watching me with cold eyes. I remained silent, trying to understand how far she intended to go. The plan was clear: to fake my mental incapacity to legally remove me from decisions about the house. For the first time, I felt my physical safety was at real risk, not just my emotional well-being. This was no longer just manipulation. It was a calculated trap disguised as concern. "She fell on her own," Melissa told the doctor, lying without blinking. In the following days, I was treated as fragile, as someone who could barely understand her own name. Melissa would give instructions to the nurses in a loud voice, as if I weren't present. She whispered with Christopher in a low tone, and he just agreed like someone who had surrendered. One day, she appeared with a paper in her hand, a power of attorney for me to sign. She said it was just to facilitate practical matters, in case I needed extended rest. I refused with a gentle smile, saying I was still recovering. She didn't insist, but I saw in her eyes that she wouldn't give up so easily. I started to record every conversation in a hidden notebook. I watched, I wrote, I listened behind doors. It was like I had returned to childhood, trying to survive in silence in a grown-up, unjust world. But this time I was the adult. And I wasn't alone. Karen noticed the tense atmosphere and began sleeping in the room next to mine. We disguised what we knew, feigning ignorance in the face of Melissa's provocations. The theatrics continued, but now I was an active part of the performance. Every move she made I recorded. I couldn't let them erase me. I knew who I was. I knew my mind was clear. And above all, I knew the time for being passive was over. Even though I was injured, my mind was sharper than ever. I needed to buy time to understand her next move. I couldn't make any mistakes. The pain in my body still throbbed, but it reminded me that I was alive, conscious, capable. I wasn't a forgetful old woman. I was a woman being tested to her limit. I feigned fragility, but my mind was alert. Karen, worried about the escalating events, decided it was time to involve Thomas. They spoke little, but she knew that if anyone could still tip the scales, it was him. She called, explained the essentials, and asked him to come see me, even if just for a few hours. First he hesitated, but something in his sister's voice convinced him. He promised to come over the weekend. I was nervous about the possibility of seeing him, and even more so with the doubt, whose side would he be on? Thomas had always been quieter, an observer, but he never took a stand. Still, something in me said there was a dormant seed of justice in him. Karen prepared everything so that when he arrived, he would see the truth without needing forced words. It was a chance to bring light to what Melissa was hiding. Melissa, upon learning of his visit, tried to prevent it with vague excuses. He has his own life, why involve more people? But Christopher, tired of the tension, didn't react. And so, Thomas's presence became inevitable. Anticipation took hold of me. Thomas had always been the most distant child. But perhaps for that very reason, his vision would be the clearest. The night before his arrival I couldn't sleep. Something told me this moment would be decisive. And I needed to be strong, alert, and ready. Maybe he was the key I was missing. Thomas arrived with calm steps, a small suitcase in hand, and the same reserved look as always. He hugged Karen, then me, with a discreet but sincere affection. He didn't say much, he never did, but his eyes traveled to every corner of the house, as if searching for traces of what he had been told. He sat at the table with all of us, saying nothing, but he observed everything. During lunch, the silence between Christopher and Melissa was cutting. She served the dishes with fake smiles, while Christopher barely looked up. Karen brought up light topics, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. And I, between sips of water and small bites of food, waited for a sign. Thomas chewed slowly, attentive to every detail. In the afternoon he walked with me in the garden, commented on the flowers, asked how I was. I didn't lie, but I didn't dramatize either. I told him what I could with the calm I had learned to cultivate over these months. He listened in silence, but every slight frown told me that what he was hearing was fitting in with what he already suspected. He didn't seem shocked. He just seemed to be confirming what his instincts were already telling him. At the end of the day, he sat in the living room with the notebook where I had written everything down. He asked to read it. I handed it over without hesitation. Thomas read for a full hour in silence, turning the pages carefully. When he finished, he stood up and kissed my forehead. He said nothing. But in that gesture, there was more truth than in 1,000 speeches. He didn't say anything, but he saw everything. It didn't take long for Melissa to realize that Thomas wasn't as neutral as she had hoped. She found him alone in the kitchen making coffee and decided to act. "Thomas, you're a rational person. You know that keeping this house is a burden for your mother," she began, with the same honeyed voice as always. He just stared at her. "This sale is for the good of everyone. And Christopher can't handle this alone," she added. Thomas didn't answer right away. He continued stirring his coffee, as if weighing every word. Melissa moved closer, trying to envelop him with her poisoned logic. "She's already confused. She fell down the stairs. She's vulnerable. You saw." He finally turned around. "I saw," he replied with a look that froze the room. Melissa took a step back, feeling her control slipping away. "You need to take the right side, Thomas," she pressed. "The side of reason, not emotion." He crossed his arms, his face impassive, and responded with something that threw her off balance. "And which is the right side, Melissa? The one that pretends to care while planning the eviction?" She didn't know what to say. "You don't know anything, Thomas," she said. But he knew. The next morning, with everyone gathered in the living room, Thomas asked to speak. The tension was almost palpable. Christopher stared at the floor, Karen crossed her arms, and Melissa held her chin high, as if she still believed she could manipulate the situation. Thomas, standing in the center, seemed taller than usual. There was firmness in his voice, and his eyes didn't waver. "I've read everything my mother wrote. I've listened to each of you. And what is happening here is wrong." Melissa interrupted, trying to defend herself, but he raised his hand and continued. "You're trying to take from her the house where our history grew, where we buried my father. And you want to do it in silence, sneakily, as if she isn't capable of understanding. But she is." Christopher tried to say something, but Thomas stared him down. "You still have time to stop this, Chris. But I won't be silent anymore. If you continue with this plan, I will report you myself." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with shock and fear. Melissa hadn't expected this. And I could barely breathe. In that instant, I knew the tide had begun to turn. For the first time, Thomas stood between me and injustice, not just as a son but as a man who chose to see. "You're going to stop this now," he said firmly. Jose arrived the day after Thomas's declaration, with a folder under his arm and determined eyes. We all sat in the living room, and he began to explain what needed to be done. According to him, the sales contract had no validity without my explicit and recorded consent. Signatures made without one's knowledge, even in a family member's name, are legally questionable. He said that to prevent them from registering the contract at the courthouse, we would file for an immediate injunction. He also suggested we collect all the evidence of coercion and manipulation we could find. Karen took quick notes, attentive to every detail. Maria offered to be a witness, willing to report everything she had seen and heard since Christmas. I listened in silence, trying to absorb every word. Jose emphasized that the case was strengthened by Thomas's testimony, as he had been a neutral party until now. The judge will understand that this isn't a trivial family dispute, but an attempt of abuse against a lucid elderly woman. That struck me. I was seen as someone in danger, and at the same time someone strong enough to resist. It was strange but comforting. For the first time, justice seemed possible. At the end of the conversation, Jose looked at me and said with his characteristic calm, "Donna, you have every right to keep what is yours. And now you have allies." Those words strengthened me in a way I hadn't expected. I took a deep breath, and finally believed that maybe there was a way out. "We have a strong case," he assured me. Karen took on the mission of gathering evidence against Melissa. She started by searching through old messages, looking for suspicious conversations and contradictory statements. She found exchanges between Christopher and his wife about how to convince me to leave the house. In others, Melissa talked about speeding things up, mentioning realtors and visits I was never told about. Karen knew exactly where to look and what to show. She installed a discreet recorder in the living room, and within a few days, she managed to capture conversations in which Melissa admitted that I was a problem to be solved with elegance. The tone of her voice in these recordings was sharp, calculating. Maria, upon hearing the audio, was horrified. "She planned everything from the beginning," she said, shaking her head in indignation. None of it seemed like an exaggeration anymore. It was real. Karen also spoke with the nurses who attended to me after my fall. One of them remembered that the rug was out of place in an unusual way on the day of the accident. Another said he found Melissa's exaggeration in claiming I was disoriented to be strange. Every detail, no matter how small, now mattered. It was like assembling a puzzle of betrayal. We created a complete dossier with dates, audio files, screenshots, and testimonies. Thomas reviewed each item, checking the authenticity of everything. Jose reviewed the material with a legal eye, always calm but firm. And I, between one silence and another, breathed more steadily. This wasn't just about the house. It was about dignity. Screenshots, audio files, testimonies. Everything went into the dossier. As the evidence mounted, something in me transformed. I was no longer just a victim. I began to look at myself with more firmness in the mirror, to walk with better posture, even with the pain still present in my hip. Karen encouraged me every day. "You're strong, Mom. Never forget that." And Jose would say, "The truth is with you. Use it with courage." I listened, absorbed, and prepared myself. Sometimes I still cried in secret. I cried for the son I no longer recognized, for the home that now felt like a battlefield. But after every tear, a renewed certainty came. I was going to see it through to the end. I could no longer retreat. Injustice had found me, but I would no longer be complicit in my own silence. Thomas spent more time with me in silence, observing everything. His presence was discreet but essential. Each day, the shame he carried seemed to transform into something nobler, protection. And that, in a way, strengthened me even more. It was the past redeeming itself before my eyes. There was no more room for hesitation. The war had been declared, and my story would not end by being erased. The coming weeks would be decisive, and I knew much more pain was to come. But now I was standing, and no longer alone. It hurt, but I was going to see it through to the end. The day of the hearing arrived like an expected storm. I left the house with a heavy heart but steady hands. Jose, Karen, Thomas, and Maria had been with me since early morning, each with a clear role in that moment. The courtroom was cold, and the wooden benches seemed intentionally uncomfortable. I sat up straight, trying to ignore the glances from all sides. Christopher entered with hesitant steps, avoiding my gaze. Melissa followed close behind, impeccable, with a rehearsed expression of confidence. Her eyes scanned the room as if she already knew the outcome, or thought she did. When she saw me, she smiled as if to say, "You don't stand a chance." But I wasn't shaken. This was no longer about fear. It was about truth. The judge entered, and everyone rose. His expression was serious but fair. Jose presented the case with clarity, while Melissa tried to counter with theatricality. Karen and Thomas were by my side like pillars, silent but present. With each new piece of evidence shown, Melissa's facade began to crack. And Christopher, shrinking more and more, no longer seemed like the same person. The tension was almost unbearable, but I took a deep breath and kept my focus. Everything I had lived through was there before that judge. Every humiliation, every pain, every silent choice of resistance. Melissa entered with the look of someone who doesn't lose. Jose handed the judge the dossier with organized evidence, audio recordings, messages, and testimonies. The judge leafed through the documents for long minutes while everyone waited in silence. When he looked up, a decision had already formed in his eyes. He began by saying it was inadmissible to conduct a real estate transaction without the consent of the living and lucid owner. Melissa tried to interrupt, but he raised his hand. Not only was there a lack of transparency, but a deliberate attempt at manipulation, he said firmly. My heart was beating like a drum, my hands trembling in my lap. When I heard the next words, the tears just came. This contract is null and void. And more. Mrs. Donna Wilson has demonstrated full capacity, discernment, and lucidity. I was no longer suspected of being fragile. I was recognized as whole. Melissa turned her face away, swallowing defeat like poison. Christopher just lowered his head, without the courage to look at me. Thomas squeezed my hand discreetly, and Karen looked at me with teary eyes. Maria smiled, emotional, as if she had also won something that day. I took a deep breath and maintained my posture, not out of pride but for justice. I had won not by force but by truth. The judge concluded with instructions for the courthouse to be notified, and the sale officially canceled. I stood up with Karen's help, and before leaving, I looked one last time at Melissa. Her gaze was empty. There was nowhere left to hide. His words, "This contract is null and void." After the session ended, the judge asked everyone to remain for a final conversation. He wanted the involved parties to hear each other out directly. Silence settled in again when he left the room, leaving just us, a broken family but still with intertwined bonds. Christopher was the first to try to speak, but his voice failed him. Melissa crossed her arms, as if protecting herself from the obvious. I was the one who stepped forward. I walked to the center of the room, my legs firm despite the weight. I looked them both in the eyes, and for the first time I didn't see power in them. "You tried to take me from my home, from my history, from my life," I began. "But you didn't succeed. Because roots built with love cannot be uprooted by lies." Melissa mumbled something, but Thomas intervened. "Listen," I continued. "Christopher, I was your mother through every pain, every achievement. And you traded me for convenience. Melissa, I welcomed you as a daughter, and you repaid me with poison. My voice no longer trembled. Their silence was the confession I needed. Karen, standing by my side, encouraged me with a simple look. And I, with every word, reclaimed my place. The room was silent when I finished. For the first time, there was no argument, no flimsy excuses. Just silence, the kind of silence that comes when the truth is heard without interruption, without a mask, without escape. For the first time, they heard my voice without interruption. Months have passed since the trial, and the house seems to have a new rhythm of breathing. The walls, once silent and heavy, now welcome the light sound of the wind and birds in the morning. I went back to tending the garden with free hands, without rush, feeling the earth between my fingers like a reunion with life. Every flower that bloomed was like a confirmation that I was where I was supposed to be. The colors seemed brighter, and time fairer. My routine returned. Waking up early, making my tea, walking through the rooms with peace in my heart. Fear gave way to serenity, and resentment was washed away by forgiveness, even if it was silent. The house wasn't just a physical space. It was my temple, my history, my sanctuary. I didn't need to move anything, because what needed to change had already changed within me. The threat was gone, but the strength that had awakened remained. The neighbors began to greet me with more warmth, perhaps because they knew what I had faced. And I learned to smile back without the weight of wanting to please everyone. For the first time in a long time, I could simply exist, without justifying myself, without fear, without shrinking. I went back to listening to my old records, to baking cakes just for pleasure. It was simple, and it was good. In the backyard, among rose bushes and hydrangeas, I sat one afternoon and closed my eyes. The breeze touched my face like an embrace from time. I felt that everything had passed, that everything had, finally, transformed. The garden was blooming like never before. Thomas began to visit me more frequently. Silent but attentive, he helped with small things and looked at me with renewed respect. Karen, my warrior, remained steadfast and close, calling every day, visiting whenever she could. Our bonds, once loosened by time and life's distances, were now stronger than ever. There were no more unresolved issues between us, only presence. Jose also became a part of my routine's landscape. We had lunch together, talked about the past, but without living in it. Life went on, but with more lightness. He never tried to fill spaces, only to add to them. With him, I learned that it's possible to start over even after 60. That mature affection has a different rhythm, and much more depth. Maria continued to be my guardian neighbor, with her sharp wit and sound advice. Together, we would laugh about the difficult memories like someone who survives a storm and, looking back, recognizes the strength they had. I didn't forget what they did to me, but I transformed it all into wisdom. Resentment gave way to clarity, and with it, to peace. I didn't have to rebuild anything alone, because in the end, family isn't about who shares the same last name, but who remains when pain reveals who we truly are. Family isn't blood, it's a choice. On a quiet evening, I sat at my desk and took out a pen and paper. I wanted to write down what I had learned, not for others but for myself. I wrote slowly, as if sealing a cycle with firmness and tenderness. Dear Donna, you survived. You survived ingratitude, the attempt to erase you, the abandonment within your own home. My hands trembled, but my heart was steady. I had won. I continued writing. You did not bend. You stood up even when they called you weak. You spoke, even when they wanted to silence you. You stayed, even when they tried to kick you out. At the end, I signed with my full name, like someone reclaiming their complete identity, and I put the letter in the drawer where there was once pain. Now there was only pride. I closed the bedroom window, looked at the whole house alive, whole mine. I no longer needed to prove myself. Everything that was necessary was already within me. I was my own home, my own foundation. And with that, there was no more room for crumbs, nor for symbols of contempt disguised as kindness. I smiled to myself, with the certainty of someone who has finally understood her own worth. And I will never again accept a mop as a gift. Now, I'm curious about you who have heard my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever gone through something similar? Support the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. I'm leaving another story on the end screen that you will also enjoy. and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.